everybody, and welcome to the Everyday Farmers Conference, all about getting started with small ruminants, which are sheep and goat primarily. Today, we are going to be talking with Siri Swanson, and we're going to talk about meats and butchering your animals, as well as shearing, because she has her own shearing business that she runs. So, Siri, can you just introduce yourself, and then we'll head on into the questions.
Yeah, hi. My name is Siri, and I own and operate Yankee Rock Farm in Vermont. We have another location in Connecticut, but we're primarily based here in central Vermont. And so we run about 50 head of registered Border Leicesters, Finn sheep, and Border Cheviots. That's the focus of our farm business is raising those purebred animals, but we produce meat and wool, and then on the side, we're also, myself and my partner are full-time shearers, and we work all around the Northeast and the Midwest, all the way to Wisconsin, shearing for flocks of all sizes, types, and kinds. That's my little summary of our happenings here.
And then can you talk a little bit, because you before the interview started, you talked a little bit about how your kind of previous experience in a butcher shop. So can you talk about like how long you were there? You said you did it, I think, in high school, so you can talk about how old you were and stuff like that.
Yeah, so when I got started with sheep, I'm a first generation farmer. So my parents have really nothing to do with this other than being great cheerleaders. So I got started as a kid in 4-H, and I came to the point where I had some rams that had to be culled. They were related to my sheep, or I'd already used them for a breeding season, and I wasn't comfortable with the idea of just shipping them out. Whether it was to auction or a buyer, I just didn't like the idea of like closing my eyes and letting whatever happen happen. So I started to reach out to some local people to just I wanted to learn the basics of processing meat. I had no intentions of going into it in any depth. I just wanted to understand how I turn my animal into a food product. So that's where I began. I ended up just falling in love with it, and really the art of it, and the connection I had to my animals and my own food. So from there, I continued searching for mentors. I worked with a couple different butchers locally. I took some classes and some short apprenticeships. And then I ended up in college. I worked in a USDA inspected facility for about 2.5 years. No super high volume, but it was a really great experience where I got to work with multiple different species in a really well established, well set up facility. So I got to hone a lot of my skills and practice things and see other techniques from other people. So I learned a lot there. And then since then, I basically just process all of my own meat. So we raise sheep. Occasionally, I buy in a pig or a veal calf. We raise some poultry, and I do all of that processing here on the farm for ourselves. So that's really all I've done with it up to this point. I decided when our shearing business picked up to kind of put the meat business down. I can still use my skills for myself, but it was a bigger venture to turn that into a real profitable business. And the shearing was kind of a simpler route to take. So not doing it too much as a job anymore, but it's definitely a day-to-day skill that I use here on the farm.
Great. And then just as a heads up for anyone watching, we are going to talk about the actual butchering process. So if that is something that you don't want to hear, then this is probably not the video for you. Because when you go into farming, a lot of times the animals get turned into meat. So whether you do it yourself or you take it out and have someone else do it, there is the processing of meat that just happens. So if you don't want to hear the nitty gritty, you can skip this video. But it's really important for anyone who really is going into farming to have this, or even just hear someone else's perspective, so that you can make the best choice for yourself personally. Because Siri, I've talked to a few people, and it's I guess we're going to kind of into the philosophy of like why you'd butcher. But a lot of people feel really connected to their animals, and the idea of having that someone else do it is actually, it hurts them emotionally more than it would just having someone else do it. Um, so can you talk a little bit about kind of what led you to the decision to do your own? I mean, you said you have experience doing others as well, but is there kind of an emotional aspect to it, or just a farm philosophy that you guys have that make you want to process your own meat?
Yeah, so I think I touched on a little bit of it in my intro, in that I don't love the idea of like turning a blind eye to it. I absolutely get a lot of people don't have the stomach or want to actually euthanize their own animal, and I completely respect that. I admit there's probably two or three individual animals in our flock who, if the day comes, if even if they're sick and we have to just put them down for humane reasons, I'm not sure I could do it. So, for anyone who's kind of gearing up to do this, maybe, and feels a little hesitant, just know that even someone like myself who's witnessed and or taken part of hundreds of kills of animals, um, there's always a little twinge and maybe a delicate spot depending on the scenario or the animal. Um, and that's something I want to hold on to. So like I have a strong sense of wanting to be responsible. If I brought an animal into this world, or I bought it from someone and I raised it for most of its life, I want to see it through. I want to be there up until its last day, and I want to make sure that nothing goes wrong. I am totally in control if I'm the one actually doing the act. That being said, it's gotten easier for me over the years, but it's never gotten easy. I usually plan my slaughter dates well, weeks in advance. And the day that I wake up knowing it's a kill day, I never feel great. It's a somber morning. I wake up, I know what has to be done, and I kind of go through a small meditation with myself. Um, I don't like to reflect back on the animal's whole life or anything. Just thinking about my connection to my animals, my land. This meat feeds my family. So, the kind of pride that I feel in that, and doing something that not everyone is comfortable with, but absolutely has to be done, whether it's in a domesticated scenario or it's out in nature. Um, Lots of different animals eat meat. And so I kind of pull myself into that headspace, um, and uh, prepare mentally in that way. So I hope that answers your question. Maybe that's a little too philosophical, but it's something I don't try and take too lightly, but at the same time, it's something I do that's pretty normal. So it's kind of a weird balance there for me.
Yeah, I've always liked the idea of honoring the animals. Um,
Hmm.
like that's kind of my favorite way of looking at it, is just you're honoring them by using them as best as you can.
Hmm.
Don't waste anything. There's a lot that you can actually get out of an animal, and instead of just doing it for meat, kind of thinking about all the ways that you can use this one particular animal for in many ways, and honoring that in all of that. So
Yeah.
I love that kind of view on it.
Hmm.
um because for a lot of people, meat is something they get at the grocery store and they don't really have to think about it.
Yeah.
um but it's like, if you actually think about where this is coming from, um you know, you can still choose to eat it. You can choose to eat it. You can choose not to eat it, but just not just kind of putting it in the back burner and just kind of going, okay, I'm just going to grab this meat from the shelf. And then you're the one who's like, well, why are you butchering other people's, your animals? That
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense to me. It's like, well, but you, you get steak in the grocery store.
Where do you think it comes from?
Like at some point, if you trace that back, there was an animal that died or was butchered, from that. So I think that, having a good mindset going into it is really important, whether you're sending them off or you're doing it yourself. Um,
Yeah.
so I love how you viewed that. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between, butchering at home or doing it in or as a business or in a facility? Maybe some of the pros and cons for each side?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really glad you brought this up too, because I think sometimes my viewpoint might sound like I'm kind of anti, you know, inspected slaughterhouse, but I'm really not. And so part of my education through college and also my just hands-on experience working in a facility, I've toured a lot of facilities through school and whatnot. And I just want to put out there blatantly that I have no issue with USDA facilities, and I think they're actually really important. So, like, I talk to people who do on farm slaughter themselves, and they badmouth inspected facilities all the time and how terrible they are and how we never want to send our animals there. And I just tell them flat out that's not my experience. I've been inside a lot of these places, and I've seen a lot of other people do on farm processing, and I've seen more things go wrong by, untrained farmers on their farm than I've seen in an inspected facility. So even though it doesn't feel as naturey because you're not outside, it is a often like concrete building with vinyl walls. It's still really well done in the most of the USDA plants out there. So don't feel turned off if that's the route that you want to go with your business or your homestead, because there are pros and cons to each. So, in an inspected facility, the the biggest thing that you're going to gain is safety. There's vets, actual veterinarians there. There are trained USDA certified inspectors, and all of the employees in these places are usually highly trained. So all of these people aren't just trained in how to handle the animals, but also how to handle food products. And crossing that line from a live animal that no matter how clean they are, there's going to be some dirt and fecal material on them, to a food product, that takes a lot of cleanliness. And these facilities are designed for that. And these people are trained to pick up on potential diseases. So I've seen, like, on Facebook and stuff, farm butchers posting pictures of, the insides of animals, which are clearly diseased, saying, oh, what's this? Should I eat it or not? And that gets a little scary sometimes. So, in a slaughterhouse, in an inspected slaughterhouse, you know that the food product you get back is gonna be safe. And if it's not, if there's any questions, they're gonna keep your animal's carcass, they're gonna quarantine it and test it. So you have that like safety net, and you have trained people watching over. So that's a plus. I guess the biggest con I can think of would be you don't necessarily have as much control over every piece of that animal. So the inspected slaughterhouse that I work with, to sell the meat that I sell, because that has to be USDA inspected, they're great, and they will always give me my hides back and all of my organs back. I can't get soup bones from them. So I lose a little bit when I send lambs to them, um, but I get the benefit of an inspected product that I know is safe to my customers. So those are the biggest pieces. There's little things here and there. Sometimes in USDA facilities, small mistakes happen, and I don't like to criticize the processors too much for it, because we all make little mistakes in our businesses. So, like, I've had some meat mixed up in a box once in a while, um, or a label done wrong. Those things happen, um, but you're also probably going to get better quality cuts. They're going to give you a more clean finished product. Or on farm, you're not going to mix up a package per se, but if you have your kids helping to label, or you're just pulled in three different directions, I've had sheep get out while I'm butchering other sheep. You got to run and put them back in. Anything can happen here too. So those little mix up, little mistakes, they're gonna happen whichever route you go. And I think that's something that we all need to kind of prepare for, because we don't always think about it. It's not an exact science per se, all the time. So, it's not as cut and dry as we always like to think.
Yeah, I think the point of, people who don't necessarily know what they're doing, especially, we talked earlier about COVID and how everything's kind of backed up, and it's like, this coming year, people might have to do their own,
Mhm.
more than they wanted to, just because the butchers are all scheduled, like sometimes even at 2022.
Yep.
Um, and that lack of experience, even just knowing what meat should look like. Like the
Mhm.
fact that you mentioned, like, posting pictures of, like, well, what is this, is this okay to eat, and it's like, oh, you know if it doesn't look like, but a lot of times people wouldn't even know what right looks like.
Mhm.
So I think that's a really good point, and I think, most other people that I've talked to, they always talk about finding a mentor,
Mhm.
someone who does know a little bit more than you.
Yeah.
You're doing your own, and, just wanted to kind of throw that out there for anyone considering doing their own. It's just maybe asking around your area and seeing if there's anyone who's done it before and having them come out and help, um, because I think that this coming year, I think it's gonna be a lot more people at home trying it for the first time, and potentially having things not go so well. um, so how many acres do you guys have?
So we own about 12 here. We have some rented pasture we use in the summertime, locally, but I don't have exact acreage on that. So we have 12 here at home.
And do you butcher at home or on the other pasture?
Yeah, we butcher here. So I like to plan my home butchers um for about this time of year actually. It's just ideal weather. So, I guess I'll slip in another pro for like a USDA facility. Unless you can build a cooler on your farm, which is a long-term goal of mine, but it doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes we're working pretty much dependent on the weather. So I'll plan a kill day, but if it's not, we had a heat wave come through here a couple weeks ago. If overnight it's not going to cool down enough, I can't necessarily leave that meat hanging outside overnight.
Mm.
Like today is a beautiful day here. It's in the 30s. This would be great weather to hang a carcass. But yeah, so that's what we do here. We usually plan a slaughter, and we do that right here on the farm, so the animal doesn't have to get in a trailer, doesn't have to move anywhere, and then we'll hang it overnight, and I'll butcher the next day. But like I said, that's all pretty weather dependent.
Yeah. And I also wanted to just add, because I know a lot of people, when we say lamb, think
Mhm.
of like little babies, but up until about a year, they're considered lambs. So even if they're full grown adult, well, yeah, fully grown, I guess you wouldn't be considered an adult, but fully grown, and most lambs, or yeah, most lambs are butchered at like a certain weight, correct? It's like 80 or
Mhm.
90, or I guess it depends on where you are, and
Yeah,
choice. But there's usually a certain weight, and then that's when you kind of decide that's when they're going. Um, and like that, I think, was it 6 to 9 months that can kind of, is when they hit that weight. Um, and they're still
typically.
considered, yeah, they're still considered lambs. So, and I don't know, is that the same for goats? Are they still considered kids up until a year, or is it different?
I As far as like in a USDA plant where there's an exact cutoff between young goat meat and old, I really don't know. I've only ever heard of goat meat referred to as chevron, or chevre. So I haven't heard it separated based on age. That's something definitely out of my realm of experience. I've butchered goats old and young personally, and there's definitely a difference in the meat, but I have never heard distinguish between the two.
Well, and I know that goat meat is not super common in the US. I know it's a lot more common in, other countries. Um, but I was like, I never remember hearing them say like kid meat.
Yeah.
When you think about it, it's kind of like, well, yeah, like there's probably a reason for it. You buy Like, I'm gonna buy a rack of kid meat. Um, I was like, that's probably why they don't use that term. But like lambs, I know a lot of people like shrink from, and I'm like, okay, it's not the cute little lambs that you can hold in your arms. They're like fully grown.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
so I,
I like to tell people even like the same thing with veal. I've raised some veal calves here and I call them veal calves. But the last one I did was like 600 pounds and he had little horns. We just never dehorned him because we didn't have a reason to. And he was mean. Like people think he was a cute little baby, but no, he was a good size animal that could do some damage, but it's still veal, it's just all about that perception.
so for you and your farm, what is your thinking process for who is going to be butchered? I mean, I know, like you just said, for an animal that has temperament issues, a lot of times that's one. Especially for like my farm, I have little kids, so having a dangerous animal that's really aggressive, that would be kind of tick the box of he needs to go. Especially
Mhm,
rams, because rams are can cause some damage. Sheep
mhm.
can't, girls can too, but for the males, they're bigger and stronger and will hit harder. So temperament is definitely one. But what do you guys? What's your guys's thought process when you're making the list of who's going?
Yeah, so we really break things down into two segments. We have the farm business, and it is a business. We're trying to make a living, and we're also trying to put out the best product we can for our customers. And then there's I like to think of it as like my non-cash payment. It's just the homestead benefits I get from having a farm. So for the farm business, we're pretty particular about lambs, and when and how they're slaughtered, and those ones go to a USDA facility that I've built up a really good relationship with. So those are always lambs that are under a year old. We are really working to revamp the genetic potential in our flock right now, to get them to a really nice carcass quality, and a really efficient um, growth pattern. So our lambs are sorted out at weaning time because we also raise and sell and show purebred stock. So at weaning, we sort out the animals that will either sell as breeding animals or keep as replacements for ourselves. And that's based on conformation, wool quality, sometimes based on the maternal line. If I'm looking to keep a brood ewe, a replacement brood ewe, I want to know she came from a good mother and maybe her grandmother was exceptional also. So there's all those things we take into consideration to remain in the purebred flock. And then all the lambs that are off sorts go into our meat program. So we'll actually separate those groups out and feed them differently. So I call that a terminal diet for the meat lambs and a non-terminal diet for the replacements. So the replacements are fed a much heavier forage diet. We're not looking to grow a carcass quite so soon. We're really looking to optimize their health. The meat lambs get a terminal diet. So we do feed some grain and some corn. We just don't have the acreage to go grass fed, and we're not looking to produce that premium high priced product. I really want to sell more to the middle of the road consumer. I want to make lamb a little bit more affordable for people around here. So those animals get pushed a little bit heavier on the corn. They still get pasture and hay, and still we keep them healthy, but we're looking to really grow them out as quickly as we can because that's um, less inputs we got to put into them, and they're going to be on our land less, which benefits our land if we can not overcrowd and whatnot. So that's how we go through the farm business side of things. For ourself, for our home freezer, it's way more dependent on just what the year looks like. So this year we had two cull ewes. One was just extremely old. She was arthritic and she raised really great lambs this year, but we felt it was her time. She didn't need to go through another lambing. So we decided to keep her and eat her for ourselves. And we had another cull ewe who was just a poor doer. She never got sick, but she just wasn't ever doing as well as the others. So that's not something we want to retain in our flock. So that's not the type of meat that I would be willing to sell to one of my customers. We could always truck them to the auction, but it didn't make sense to us this fall. So I butchered those two for ourselves. We also have a ram that we're currently renting out as a stud buck, but we don't need to keep him any longer in our breeding program. So once they're done using him, we'll probably butcher him and also put him in the freezer. He's got a really pretty fleece, so I'm thinking that he'll make a nice pelt. So those are different things that go into the decisions for whether we send them to the auction barn or we cull them and keep the meat for ourselves. We like to avoid the auction barn as much as possible because of that whole philosophy around giving the animal like the best end to its life that we can. And also that's how we sustain ourselves. We don't eat any of the USDA inspected lamb. We sell all of it. So this is the meat that kind of the farm paid for us instead of a paycheck necessarily every week. We get to put 3, 4, 5 lambs in the, or not lambs, but sheep in the freezer for ourselves. So it really depends on just where we are with cull ewes or rams or whatever isn't good enough to be considered a product that I would sell.
Yeah. Well, and I think, because you mentioned, or we mentioned kind of the weight, and I do remember that someone, had said that when you ship them out, they are under stress, um,
Hmm.
because they're being moved, and
Hmm.
that they'll lose a little bit of weight. Um,
Yes.
so what's kind of when you're shipping them out versus when you're butchering at home, what is the weight you guys are looking for? Is it different or is it the same? Um,
Yeah. It's two totally different targets. So with our um lambs that we're going to sell to someone, we shoot for them to be at about 63% of their mother's mature weight. So if you think of your ewes and you average out their weight, in my flock, the average weight of all of our brood ewes is around 170 pounds. We want our lambs to finish. So finish is when they're ready for kill to be about 63% of that live weight. So this year, all of our meat lambs, we did two different slaughter dates. We did some summer with some of our best growing animals, and we did some fall with some of the slower growing animals. And they all finished at about 110 to 120 pounds live weight, which gave us 50 to 70-pound carcasses. And that was pretty good. We're pretty happy with how they did. And that's definitely what my customers want to see. That's going to change around the country. Here in the Northeast, there's a much bigger demand for some smaller lambs. Out in the Midwest, they'll grow feeder lambs up to 150 or 160 pounds because people want much bigger cuts of meat. So it's definitely important if you're looking to sell it to know what your customer wants. For ourselves, totally different. I really like that 60-pound carcass. If I was in a, if it was a perfect world and I could keep feeder lambs for myself, if I'm butchering cull ewes, um, the I can't really decide on size because they're already mature. But what I do like to kind of play around with is the fat cover. So personally, I eat a lot of animal fats, and my family is well accustomed to that. We like pretty fatty cuts, and any fat that doesn't remain on a cut of meat, I'll actually keep and I render, and we make a lot of lard that I end up cooking with. So that's something I would never do for my customers because I know they don't want excess fat. But I always like to fatten my animals up a little bit because I benefit from that.
Great. Um, yeah, that's really interesting about the fat because we had talked a little bit about using all of the animal, and so
Hmm.
that's definitely one of those. Nothing goes to waste. Um,
Hmm.
when you send it to the mill or the butcher, um, do they give that back to you, or do you have to specify that, or do they keep it?
Yeah.
You
The,
mentioned that you have more control on the farm when you butcher, and so what are the, like, restrictions in that aspect when you don't butcher yourself?
yeah. So every slaughterhouse that you work with is going to have some different things that they'll kind of do for you. But that doesn't mean you couldn't ask them, even if it's not listed on the cut sheet, that you can get fat or bones or organs back. Never hurts to ask, hey, could we get some kidney fat? Some places will be willing to do it and some places won't. So as far as fat goes, especially on something like sheep, none of these slaughterhouses want that. They're not going to really benefit from keeping it from you. The only reason they might not want to give it back is because it's an extra thing they have to tag and process and package and make sure it gets to you. Um, but yeah, so the plant that I currently work with, they will give me back fat. They'll give me back organs and they'll give me hides. They don't like to package extra bones. There's another plant that I work with to make sausage for me, and they'll give me everything. So it really depends where you are, what slaughterhouses you work with. But yeah, don't be afraid to talk with them, because most of them do not want to keep any of these things. They're going to end up in rendering. They're probably going to be made into dog food if you don't take them. So um, on the farm, it is easier because I can just take those things out and keep them for myself. But lots of slaughterhouses will probably work with you to get them back.
Yeah, because one of the things I'm thinking about is like rennet, for
Hmm.
bees. Um,
Yeah.
you definitely like that's one of the ones that most people I think would want to save if they're cheesemakers
Mhm.
from their own animals, and so that's one to ask. And if they don't, then that's maybe one reason why you would want a home butcher if wherever you are or whatever's near you doesn't provide that.
Mhm.
Um, so we talked a little bit about the emotional prep of the day where you're butchering. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, what would be the word? Uh, the the manual prep, I guess. So that'd be like
Yeah.
prepping your tools. What kind of clothes? Like, do you wear any special clothes? I know, at least in my head, all butchers wear like those really long, those long aprons.
Yeah.
um, when you do it at home, what's your prep like?
Yeah, so I like to, like, first thing in the morning, I like to gather up all of my tools. And so, like I've mentioned, I usually do slaughter one day, hang that carcass overnight, and butcher the next. So I can really separate the two jobs, which is just most convenient for me. That's how my brain kind of works about these things. So for slaughter day, I pull out all of my tools, and at this point, I've got a pretty good checklist worked up. But I just run through the process in my head. So, I need a gun to dispatch the animal. I need my ideal bleeding and skinning knife. I need some buckets. I like to have some rags with me just to wipe my hands off. The Gambral. I have a pulley, to hang the animal. All the things. And of course, I put everything away clean, but I look over everything again before I get started, and I might just wipe stuff down with some hot water or vinegar. Um, and then I like to, once I have everything gathered, I kind of get set up. So I have an old dairy barn here on our farm, and out back, there's actually a really nice concrete pad with no barn left around it, but it's a really great place because the ground is pretty clean. It's a nice place for me to work, and I have a little frame overhead that I can hang a sheep from. So that's where I've set up to do slaughter. I get all my stuff over there. I make sure I have absolutely everything ready. I don't have running water over there, so I just bring a couple 5-gallon buckets of hot water and get that all ready. As for clothing, I have worked with a plastic apron and I have worked without. The biggest benefit is that it does get messy. Even if you do a perfectly clean job, you're going to want to be washing your hands at least a couple times. There's blood that's going to spill. And even if you don't burst any organs while you're gutting an animal, there's, just bodily fluids that will come out. So having one of those big aprons, or even like almost like waders on, will keep you dry. And if you have more than one animal to do, that might be pretty important for you. whatever you do, just make sure it's clean. Don't do morning farm chores and then go kill in the same clothes. Like I said about the USDA plant, they're going to be super clean. I try to emulate that at home as much as I can. So, of course, I'm not in a big sanitized building, but I put on fresh, clean clothes that I know, the cat or dog didn't get into. Um, and I make sure I'm clean. I have my hair pulled back. I've washed my hands at least a couple times, rubber boots, the whole thing. I try and be pretty clean about the whole process.
So there's no like cleaning the meat after, or is it just in principle the idea of the more clean the whole process can be, the cleaner the meat in the end will be?
Yeah, definitely. And so, like in the plant that I worked in, we weren't allowed to wash off the meat until the very end because if you so for example, when you first start to skin an animal, you open up that hide. Even if you're doing everything right, some dirt, if the leg has any bit of dirt on it, might fall onto the meat. So when you spray that, you aren't necessarily getting rid of it,
Mm.
you're just washing it onto a different part of the carcass. So we really tried to avoid any of that. And instead, what we did there and what I do at home is once the animal is entirely skun and gutted, I go over it and trim off any dirt or fecal material. Um, so, you can do something different at home. I know people who have argued with me on this before, but I like the idea of not washing it off because water doesn't necessarily wash off bacteria. Trim off any dirt or fecal material that you see, and that should give you the cleanest product possible.
Okay, that's so interesting. I mean, because it makes sense when you think about washing dirt off. It kind of more spreads it. I mean, unless you're using soap, which you wouldn't use on meat.
Yeah.
It does kind of spread it out more than it does completely take all the bacteria off. Because you can't, even if you can't see it, there's still bacteria and stuff on it. So just keep it
Exactly.
as clean as possible.
Mhm.
Um, so can you talk, so because you talked about doing it, like, you do certain things on certain days. How many, do you, slaughter, I guess, on the first day? What's your kind of maximum number you would do, just probably for physical purposes? I know that shearing is kind of the same, where it's just exhausting, physically. So
Yeah.
what's kind of your, like, I maximum, I can't do more than this physically?
Yeah, so for slaughtering, if I had a walk-in cooler where I could hang sheep afterwards, I can do probably a dozen in a day. Um, but that's taken me years to get up to. So when I was first doing this for myself, one or two animals would exhaust me, both physically and mentally. It wasn't so instinctual to go through the whole process. So I had to think a lot more about next step, next step, next step, and keeping things clean and making sure I'm doing it right. And it is a physical activity, so it does wear out your body. Um, Now I'm up to the point where I could do a dozen a day, but when we get to butchering, I'm a lot slower. So just skinning and gutting an animal doesn't take near as much time or work as breaking down an entire carcass, packaging it, and labeling it, and getting it in the freezer. So the most that I like to butcher in a day is 3 animals. So for that reason, I would never slaughter more than 3 in a day for myself.
And at least as you're saying the physical aspect, I'm just thinking I'm 5'3", and I don't know how tall are you?
I'm 5'2".
Okay, so like we're pretty small.
Yeah.
And I think it depends on the breed of sheep you have as well. Like I know just getting my sheep onto like a milking parlor stand, just to stand itself, like I physically am struggling with the animal sometimes to get it up there. And so I think it would also depend on the size. I know a lot of people will go with smaller sheep if they're smaller people just because it's easier to handle.
Mhm.
Whereas, like we had to do, because we're primarily milk, we didn't have a ton of options for breed. It was basically get the breed of sheep that produces the most milk. And so They're probably average to big, at least to me.
Yeah.
Someone who's 5'3", like, the idea of, like, trying to lift them even, like, oh my gosh, the idea of, like, putting them on something to lift them up just sounds physically tiring. Um, like, I was like, "I don't even know if I'd be able to do it," at the state I am at now. But, I mean, I would think that that would also affect how many you can do,
Mhm.
um, in a given day. I mean, if you're really, really struggling because 'cause you're just physically small or you're not in its great shape, I would think that, like, 1 would probably just wear you out. But like you said, because you've built up, because of your business, I know shearing takes a lot of, muscle too.
Yeah.
So, you're probably a lot more physically capable. So even 2 or 3 for you, for someone else just starting, like 1 is probably like a good one to start just because, like, for me, I'm like, I wouldn't even I like you said, the mental aspect is one thing, but then
Yeah.
you full physical and it's like, "Oh, no. No, no, no." Um, so can you talk a little bit about, how you separate the sheep that you're going to slaughter, and how you pull them over to your stand, and how kind of walk us through what a process would be for one of your sheep.
Yeah, sure. So, all of our animals are handled quite a bit. We show our sheep, and even if they don't get shown, we just the way that our systems work, moving animals and such, everyone is exposed to a halter at some point. So that's huge. And I'll tell people if, like, so in the plant that I've worked in, we butchered a lot of grass-fed beef through there, and those grass-fed beef might be the best quality meat that we've ever seen, but those animals have a stressful ending because they have been on 200 acres their entire life. They've only seen people when they move pasture, so they're just bonkers when they have to get on a trailer and come through a chute, and there's people standing near them even if we're quiet and calm. So yeah, so our animals, even especially if I know that we're going to process them, I want them to be used to me. Any person, I want them to know what a halter's like, and I want them to not be super stressed out just when I go to grab them. I know some people who will euthanize animals in a pen with other animals. I don't think that stresses out the other animals, um, but it's a risk. It's a dangerous risk, so I don't do that. I'm a pretty well practiced and trained with my rifle that I use for this, but anything can happen. So I'll catch an animal and we'll lead it over to our kill spot. And I have a post, a headlock would be ideal for someone maybe who's getting into this, but I just have a post that I tie that halter to. And my animals are usually halter trained, so they don't freak out or anything. And then this is the step of the process where I take the most time. If the animal is just sniffing around, or if it wants to look around or look at me, then I let it kind of adjust. And I don't really have the words to explain when I know it's ready, but it's just a feeling of that animal is okay in its surroundings, and it's at a good point where I can approach it and ultimately kill it. It takes longer for some animals than others, um, but that's my moment of pause along this process. So once that animal is calmed down, settled in, I approach it. I like to be on the left side, but it doesn't really matter. And I have a 22 caliber rifle that I use, and I shoot them just once in the head. That being said, I always carry with me multiple bullets because you would rather shoot an animal a second time to be absolutely sure it's unconscious than make a mistake and not have that backup plan. So I always have multiple bullets in my pocket. I like to keep one kind of just in the corner of my mouth so it's right there if an animal doesn't go down on that first bullet. Um, and with the hundreds of animals that I've done, I have made mistakes. No one likes to talk about them. I won't share any details, but just, it happens, and don't be ashamed if or when it happens to you. have that backup plan ready. If you don't have that backup plan ready, then shame on you, because it's an animal's life you're working with here. So once that's done, in an instant, I will make sure my gun is unloaded and the safety's on. Put it in my safe spot, which is a couple feet away, and then I have a pretty short bladed knife that I use to bleed them. So if you shoot an animal right and stun it, they'll kind of instantly just drop, which makes approaching them again with your knife really easy. I grab them by the ear, and right under the jaw is where I'm aiming to cut their jugular. So I pick up the ear, I find the jaw, I go in and cut out, and that makes a really clean bleed. If everything is going as planned, I like to pick up the other ear and make another cut on the other side. That gives that animal the best bleed possible, which at this point, the animal should be unconscious, so it shouldn't be feeling anything. It is basically dead, but we don't know. So I rather make sure they're bleeding out as best as possible, and it does improve meat quality if you get a good bleed. So all of that happens in a matter of seconds, and then is another moment of kind of pause where I wait for that animal to totally bleed out. Sometimes the nervous system is still kicking even if that animal is dead. Their body will simply react. So one thing I forgot that's super important: after I shoot the animal, I check the corneal reflex. So that is, if you go to touch your eye right now, your body's instinct should be to close the eye. And if you practice with any of your sheep at home, unless they're blind, they should do the same. So after I stun the animal, I check the corneal reflex. If the corneal reflex is gone, if I can touch the eyeball, in theory, that animal is unconscious. It's not feeling anything. So that's my check before I bleed it out. So at that point, once I stun it, check its reflexes, and bleed it out, it is dead. But there still might be some thrashing. And this is when people tend to get upset. People I work with, maybe helping them learn, or they're watching this for the first time, they think an animal is suffering. And this is kind of where the science comes in, that I think is super cool, because I know the animal isn't suffering, but the body is still fighting for life. So the animal doesn't feel anything, it's not alive, but the muscles and the nerves are still saying, like, oh my gosh, we're out of oxygen, we're out of blood, what's going on? So we fight. So sometimes an animal's legs will kick. In pigs especially, you'll have what's called an agonal gasp. So it's basically their brain running out of oxygen, sending a signal to its lungs saying, like, we need air now. So I've seen it plenty of times in USDA facilities where a pig is plenty dead, but it'll just and it's that, like, the body's last reflexes. So we wait for all that to end, basically, because you don't want to be approaching an animal with a knife to start skinning it and get kicked. And that is different per animal. Sometimes it takes just a couple seconds. Sometimes I've had animals go as long as 2 or 3 minutes. And then we get started. So the first part is skinning. And then once the hide is completely removed, I take the heads off. I haven't done anything with heads. I use tongues in cooking, and the heads, the only thing I save heads for is for my 4-Hers. So I actually do a bunch of dissections with 4-H workshops and stuff. And so I'll save heads, eyeballs, brains, those things for educational purposes. And then I eviscerate. So remove all the innards, saving what organs I want. Do my final trim. Like I mentioned, I make sure I remove any dirt or fecal material I might find. And then that's basically it. I get it hung where I'm going to hang it for the night and begin cleanup.
So do you do all the cutting before you hang up? Like the hanging up is the last thing you do?
No, so that's a great question. So once an animal is totally dead and I'm ready to start the work, really, I open up the hide on the back legs So you basically make a cut from just past the hock down to its crotch, and then do the same thing on the other leg, meeting up with that cut. I peel back the skin on that leg, and basically skin it down to the shank so I can get the gambrel through that tendon. So I've actually heard this tendon referred to as the Gambral tendon. And, it's on dogs, it's on sheep, cows, any animal really, any quadruped has that tendon from going from its hock up to its leg, and that's where you want to hang them. So whether you have a hook or a gambrel, whatever, the first step is exposing those tendons on either side so you can get your hooks in, and then I hang the animal. And I have a pulley so I can hoist them kind of halfway to get that first part at my eye level to work with, and then I'll hoist them all the way up to, work my way down to the neck and head.
And so this would be after the twitching is done, right? So
Yep.
that's kind of when it happens. Um,
Yeah.
so when you shoot the animal, because I know after watching Swamp People that like they talk about that little quarter on the alligator, and I know sheep aren't
Yeah.
alligators, but is there is there certain places that you're aiming for when you shoot? Is it like if you shoot in a certain place, it happens faster, or it's a little bit more humane, or
Mhm.
does it not really matter as long as it's anywhere like in that area?
Yeah, so your biggest target, the most important target you're looking for is the brain. Now, I've heard from all different old school farmers, different ways and methods of hitting the brain. Some of them don't sound like the best way to me. So, based on research, based on science, um, the ideal spot to put a sheep down is the very top of their poll. So if you look at a sheep's head, it's easiest to look at a sheep who doesn't have wool all over their head. So if you have like Romneys or Oxfords or something, you're out of luck here to see it easily. But there's literally a point kind of in the middle of their head. And it's usually right between where they would have horns if they don't have horns. And it looks like a little dimple. On old rams and some old ewes, it's really prominent. On some lambs, it's not as easy to see. But I definitely would suggest to anyone thinking about doing this, days before, weeks before you want to actually do a slaughter, just look at your animals. Take a look at their head and find that spot. And what you're looking for when you shoot them is for their head to be very natural, and you want to shoot straight up and down. So if that animal's looking up, you need to either wait for the animal to put its head down or move your aim with it. So that's part of why I wait oftentimes, because I'm much more comfortable just shooting straight up and down. And so I want that animal's head to be in a natural position. And if everything lines up that way, you should go straight through the brain and scramble it pretty well to the point that, so they don't feel anything.
So you mentioned the fact that wool can affect finding it. Does the
Mhm.
color of the sheep, because we have like our farm, we have both full white and then we have some black. Is
Mhm.
it harder to tell on blacks than with the white sheep, or is it really noticeable on either as long as the wool's gone?
Yeah, I've with all of my experience, I haven't seen that it's harder on based on color. It's more individual hair coats and wool. So even if your sheep are free of wool from their heads, if you're one of those breeds of sheep, sometimes like lambs have a really nice thick hair coat on their face, and that might make it a little harder to find. Another tip, if you're a little nervous or this is new to you, is you can take like a regular livestock crayon or livestock spray paint, find that spot on their head a couple hours before or when you're getting ready to do it, and put a little dot there, and then you don't have to think about it. When you have a loaded gun in your hands, it takes one of those things you have to concentrate on, kind of out of your mind, so you don't have to worry about it so much. And we actually did that in the USDA plant that I was working at, when people were learning how to stun cows for the first time. My teacher would often use a crayon, and it's a different spot on cows, but he would mark it out for you, so you don't have to worry that you're going to make that mistake.
Well, and like you said, for sheep that aren't handled very much, like in
Mhm.
they're thrashing or moving around or, obviously, you wouldn't wanna try to shoot them then, but,
Mhm,
it might take them longer to settle, and even then, they might still wiggle.
mhm,
So having kind of a target is probably really, really helpful.
definitely.
So once he's hung, or he, she, it is hung, why is it that you wait a day?
So ideally, I'd like to wait a week. If I had that walk-in cooler or the temperatures are just absolutely perfect here, then a week gives you pretty great meat quality.
Mm.
Um, and what it does, I don't know the specific science, I admit, but it just lets the muscle fibers kind of relax. So things tenderize, flavors increase a little bit. It's not quite dry aging, but you can almost think of a similar process where the meat loses a little bit of water, so it's going to intensify that flavor and the tenderness. Um, and it's like a minimal aging that you can do. So if I don't have a week, then a day at least does a little bit of that, but it also gives me time to rest. So like I've mentioned a couple times, slaughter is just it's tough work mentally and physically. So I really enjoy um, uh, cleaning up after a slaughter and relaxing a little bit. Maybe whether I have to like reflect mentally on the fact that I've killed an animal or just sit in front of the TV for an hour and just like veg. It's a nice break between the next day when everything's dead. I don't have to think about live animals anymore. And I'm looking at food and I'm looking at something that I need to prepare for my family to eat.
So I know that once the animal hits a certain age, their meat gets tougher. And so you mentioned like hanging the meat out so it gets tastier. Uh, would you prefer to leave them out longer if they're older animals, or does that not really matter? It's kind of as long as they've hit a certain point, the meat can't really get any better, or is it the longer it's hung, the better it could possibly get if you're doing it for older animals?
Yeah, so the longer the better for sure. So cellular respiration is going to still be happening. And so the only thing that might limit you if you don't, is the temperatures. So, you don't want to hang that meat outside if it's 60 or 50 or even 40 degrees. Um, but also fat. So, a sheep with a decent fat cover is going to preserve, even in a good walk in cooler, it's going to preserve longer better. I culled one of my 4-H lambs once when she was 4 years old. She was an old girl at that point, and she was kind of a pet to me. So she stayed around longer than she should have, and she got really fat. Well, it was not great quality meat to anyone with a normal palate, but because she had so much fat on her, and I had access to a cooler at that point, I hung her for 2 or 3 weeks, and that meat was delicious. But that thick fat cover helped preserve the meat because even in a walk-in cooler, the meat's not frozen, and mold can grow. So those two cull ewes that I did just recently, I actually did use a friend's walk-in cooler, and we hung them for a little over a week. And that's because, they were old. One of them was 9 years old. So I really wanted to set as much tenderness as I could into that. And also, um, it didn't have quite as much fat cover on it, but as a sheep for myself, I was okay trimming away a little bit. So there was a couple specks of mold on it, and I could just cut that piece of meat out and toss it because it's not a lamb that I'm trying to meet margins on. It's just for myself. So a little bit of meat that went to dog food or fed the birds outside was okay with me.
Yeah, and you said that because you would put it in a cooler, it's not a freezer, so I'm assuming that you wouldn't keep it in there after a certain point. Like, you probably are going in and checking, and if anything seems like it's
Yeah.
gonna turn, then you would just go, "Okay, we need to process it,
Yep.
um, now," or, "Oh, okay, it can last, maybe a day or 2, but we just gotta keep, keeping an eye on it." Um, would you ever freeze an animal at this point, or would you wait until it is fully processed? Because I know people see like, was it Rocky where, like the frozen meats hanging on
Yeah.
a stick or on a hook. Um,
Mhm.
would freezing it at this point damage it or affect it at all?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't damage it per se, but it would affect it. So every freeze thaw that meat goes through, um, you lose juiciness, you lose tenderness, you lose flavor. So you don't really want to freeze it at this point. Thaw it again, and then cut it up and freeze it again for those individual cuts that you're going to put in the freezer. So yeah, you definitely want to avoid trying to freeze it at that stage. It's also just really inconvenient to thaw a whole carcass. Whether you've seen a sheep skinned out or not, think about like the size of their legs, and then the loin and the ribs. So when all the guts are removed, the actual muscle and meat on the midsection is minimal. It's only that much maybe, but a leg could be 10 pounds, like a ham almost. So to
Mm.
thaw out a whole carcass, the point that the ribs and the loin are going to thaw is way different than the shoulder or the hindquarters.
Same with cooking. Like you wouldn't cook
Mhm.
them both at the same time because
Exactly.
one
Yeah.
would be done and the other one would be burnt. Uh,
Yep.
okay, so that makes sense. When you clean your tools, do you do boiling to like sanitize, or is there a temperature? I know like for like cleaning milking supplies, like you have to hit a certain temperature to kill off some bacteria. So how do you clean off your tools once the butchering or the gutting is done?
Mhm. Um, so I swap out different disinfectants. I just use vinegar and bleach for my home processing, and I swap it out. And that's something that I was taught from one of the butchers I worked with um, as an apprentice. And so you swap out what you're using, because if you use the same thing over and over again, it's kind of like the same principles with dewormer. The bugs or the bacteria can become resistant. So you never want to use the same cleaner again and again and again. The only constant you do want is like scorching hot water. So I don't boil my tools, but I do use very hot water. I'm lucky enough that I have like a hot water spigot outside. So I don't take a temp. When I worked in the plant, we did, have to temp all of our water to make sure it was hot enough. And if you want to be super careful, it's a really good idea. Um, but I wash everything down. I spray everything down with super hot water. And then I scrub everything with either a vinegar water mix or a bleach water mix. Sometimes if stuff is wicked greasy, I'll also hit it first with just like some dish soap. If I worked with a really fatty animal and everything is just covered in fat, I'll use some dish soap to kind of cut through that grease and then go over it with the vinegar or the bleach. And then I do another hot water rinse. I let everything air dry. I inspect everything before I put it away. So I've definitely gone back and rewashed things if I thought I missed something. Like I use a handsaw. I don't use any electric tools. And so my handsaw sometimes is really tricky to clean thoroughly. That sometimes goes through a couple washes. Um, yeah, I that's basically it. And then we put everything away. And like I said, when I go to do another kill, whether it's weeks or months later, I inspect everything again when I pull it out and make sure it doesn't need to be re-cleaned before we use it again.
Do you clean between sheep, or is it if it's one day, I just do all three and then I'll clean?
Yeah, I do a not a complete clean, but a good wash down between everything. Um, if I'm wearing like any of my aprons or something, I'll definitely wash that all down before I go on to the next sheep. And I might refresh my buckets of water at my slaughter place. I don't have running water, so I might refresh that. I'll get a new rag that I use to dry my hands off. So I'll kind of refresh, but not do a complete clean.
Yeah, and so when you were talking about hot water, I was just thinking like of grabbing like a teapot, like heating up a teapot and like sprinkling. If you don't have like a warm like hose,
Oh
like
yeah.
we're one of the farms that are, like, so minimal that, like, that's where my head immediately went. I was like, "Well, just
Yeah.
heat up the tea and just sprinkle it over over
Oh
the."
yeah, get creative with it, whatever works. Like we have a little chicken scalder, and I have actually used that when I'm processing chickens. After we scald them all, I've dumped that water out, refilled it with hot water, and then used that um, bucket of scalding water to sanitize my tools.
Yeah,
So
and it
whatever
kinda
works.
also depends on where you are too, like, if you're out in the field doing it
Yeah.
versus closer to home,
Yep.
'cause that so you just kind of make do with where you are and what you're doing.
Mhm.
So once the animal has been hanging for however long it's being hung, is this at the point where you cut them into particular cuts?
Yeah. Yep. So the way I was trained is just by primals. So those are your bigger cuts. And primals are really important when you're getting into something like a veal or pork or beef because you're working with a huge carcass. So going from the primal to the subprimal to the cut is much more extensive. With sheep, it's pretty easy. Sheep and goats are actually great animals to learn butchering on because there's really only 5 primals. So I'll break an animal down into all the primals, and then I'll work one primal at a time. So if I'm doing like 2 sheep, I might take the shoulder primal off of both of those sheep and work over 2 shoulders at once. Just for efficiency, I rather be doing that than a shoulder and then a rack and then a loin and then another shoulder and a rack and a loin. So yeah, so those primals on a sheep, I think they're nearly identical on a goat, would be your neck, your shoulder, foreshank and breast, the rack, the loin, and the leg. Um, so I cut each of those into what I call retail cuts, whether it's going into a retail setting or not, just your home use. That's how they're classified. So those are cuts that we're all used to seeing in the grocery store. So it could be just stew meat, or it could be a shoulder roast, or a rack of lamb, or a loin chop. All those things are retail cuts. And then I also have a big bowl that I fill with trim. So all of my trim meat, I grind, and that's what we have for ground meat.
Do you do any sausages for those, or is it mostly just ground?
Yeah, I've not experimented much with sausage. I've made some in a USDA setting with my own sheep because the setup was so much nicer and more convenient. um,
All
so
there?
I have, yeah, we've made some chorizo in merguez with some old collius, and that came out really good. I haven't. I made some pork sausage at home once, and it came out great, but the the whole casing and seasoning and resting and the proper temperatures to fine ground, it doesn't fit in my daily schedule usually when I'm trying to get sheep processed.
It's
um,
a longer process because
yeah.
it's I mean, anything that's cured meat where
Mhm,
you're like, I think even bacon and stuff, like, that stuff, depending on how you cure it, can
mhm,
take lots of steps.
yeah.
So what's your favorite cut?
Oh, my favorite thing, possibly just for convenience, but it is super tasty, is shanks. So I was told by one of the first butchers I trained with, never grind shanks. Part of it is because it makes poor quality ground. Um, there's just no way around the amount of tendons and cartilage and silver skin in a shank. Also, they're just delicious, and people overlook them frequently. So we have shanks all the time. I put them in the crock pot. So I take them out a day in advance, put them in the crock pot with literally any type of flavor you want. In the summertime, my favorite thing is like some cumin and lemon and white wine, maybe some stock, really light flavors. Cook them 12 hours, 4 hours, and they just melt. They are so tasty, and all that cartilage just melts away. In the winter time, I'll do like a red wine and carrot and potato blend. So, a little more seasonal flavors there. But yeah, shanks are hands down the most underrated um, cut of lamb that we should all be appreciating.
Yeah, I love the idea of that. I don't know if I've ever had one. Um, the most I've done with lamb is I did a crown of lamb. Um,
Mhm,
it was the Alton Brown recipe, and it was just one of those like, let's just give it a try, and it tasted amazing. Um,
mhm.
and I'm just so pro sheep meat.
Yeah.
I wasn't raised on it, and but I was like, in the long run, I think I like it better than beef. Um,
Mm.
which is so funny because my husband's like, I prefer beef. He's just a man. Yes. But I was like, no, I like the lamb. It's a little higher quality. But I mean, there's some. Is that your favorite recipe, or do you have like, I know that's your favorite cut, but is there like a something you're like, I make all the time, or I don't make it all the time, but it is heavenly?
Yeah, there's 2 things, and they're, like, opposite ends of the spectrum. I make really delicious mutton meat pies, and so we end up with a ton of ground meat just because of the type of sheep that we often keep for ourselves. And so I'm always looking for something other than, like, hamburgers or lasagna, and so, I make mutton pies, um, and I just season it with kind of whatever I want, usually like some Worcestershire sauce and salt, pepper, garlic. I throw in diced vegetables, fill it in either mini pie crust or I'll make a big one. And that's a real crowd pleaser. And that's an easy one. If it's a special occasion and we have a reason to eat rib chops, those are my favorite.
Mm.
And it's such a great cut of meat. I like to do basically nothing. So I'll salt and pepper them, and then I sear them really hot on 3 sides in a mix of butter and olive oil. Get a nice crust on the fat side and both cut sides, and then I throw it in the oven for like 5 minutes at 400. They come out beautifully rare. Just some salt, but a nice crusted exterior, and you really appreciate the meat quality there. So
I love
those are my 2 favorites.
I love that you mentioned meat pies because I was born and raised in Orange County, and so at least on the West Coast, like, meat pies were not something that we really grew up with. I don't know about the East Coast, but West Coast was definitely, we're like, I like, you hear about it, but it wasn't something that like I've tasted too much of. And then we went, I visited Scotland, and I'm like, I love meat pies.
Yeah,
Like, if you've never had a meat pie, try to get one that's like nicer, because I'm sure if you get like the low quality meat, it probably isn't as
yeah.
nice. Um, and if you're not a cook like me, then it probably wouldn't turn out great. But like, try one that like with someone who knows what they're doing, and it's really really good. So I was like, I'm glad you mentioned the meat pies, because at least in my neck of the woods, it wasn't something that was a very common meal. Um,
Hmm.
I think people think of pies and they're like, so is it a dessert?
Yeah.
Like, no, it's basically like chicken pot pie, but
Yeah,
but
exactly.
with other meats and fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. Or not fruit, but vegetables.
Yeah.
So let's see. Is there anything about the butchering process that I didn't cover, or that I don't know too much about? Because I mean, I'm assuming it's the butchering, then you're the hanging, and then it's
Mhm.
the actual cutting the pieces. And then I'm assuming it just goes straight to the actual cooking. Um, I mean, I guess we can talk a little bit about storage.
Yeah.
How you package, because I think that's the process I skipped between the cuts and the delicious food. So can we talk a little bit about, once they're cut, how do you store them? Like you said, you send them to the butcher sometimes, so I'm assuming they process them themselves, they package it, and then they send you the packaged product. Um,
Yeah.
or do they don't sell it straight from the butcher, right? That you get it back.
Right. Yep. I get it all cut and wrapped.
Okay. But then, so for the stuff you do at home, how do you
Mhm.
package and store that?
Yeah. So I get asked this all the time because I prefer paper wrapping my meat.
Mhm.
Um, I have been given like 3 of those food saver vacuum sealers because people think that I need them, and they work. If that's what works for you, no criticism. But I have this weird thing. I hate relying on any type of like electronic thing that might break while I'm in this process. I
Mm,
just don't like being held up when I'm dealing with butchering or slaughtering. So I use like no power tools when I'm actually cutting. And then when I get to packaging, I also don't want to have to plug something in that could fail at any point. Uh, so for that reason, but also because if you paper wrap things as well as possible, which does take practice, I admit, but if you paper wrap them well, it'll preserve your meat just as well as a home-sized vacuum sealer. There's definitely like industrial vacuum sealers that would do better than my paper wrapping, but most of us aren't going to be able to afford those. Um, so for your home options, I think paper is just the way to go. Like I said, it doesn't break. It's never gonna just die on you, and um, I just like working with paper better than so much plastic when I think about like waste and sustainability. Anything that wraps your meat has to be thrown away for safety reasons. Well, I rather compost the paper packaging than throw away all that plastic.
mm.
Um, and it looks nice. It's a really nice aesthetic to have a freezer full of paper wrapped meat with handwritten labels. Um, yeah, it's kind of my favorite step of the process, maybe because I'm finishing up for the day, but also it's relaxing. I clean off my table, I have all my cuts organized, and I wrap everything. It feels a little more old fashioned, maybe. It's just really enjoyable for me. So everything's paper wrapped and then put in one of my multiple chest freezers. So the only tip I have for that is if you're like putting away a whole sheep or two whole sheep, um, if you like to organize as much as I do, you're gonna want to put it all, in one spot. But do not crowd a bunch of raw meat in your freezer, because in the center, that might not get frozen for quite a while. The exterior packages can kind of insulate. So I will spread out all of the freshly cut meat in their packages. And then the next day, once I know everything has been completely frozen, I'll go back in and organize.
Well, that's a great tip. Um,
Hmm.
because I think a lot of people would just think to save space, even if it's not just organization, but maybe you don't have a lot of space in
Hmm.
your freezer and you're just like, well, let's just all put it in this corner.
Yeah.
And then realizing, oh, well, one thing didn't get frozen all the way. And I'm assuming if it doesn't get frozen at a certain point, it's probably going to affect the actual meat and maybe make it unusable. Um, I also love the idea that you mentioned you don't like relying on electronics, um, especially because when it comes to meat, and I'm in the milk world, so milk as well, that time and leaving things out is huge. It's
Hmm.
you just don't want them to be left out at any length of period. So
Yeah.
something to break on you or not work, and then I'll all of a sudden have not either don't have the skills to wrap it with paper, or you don't have the materials, then you're kind of out of luck, and then you could potentially be wasting a lot of the products that you worked so hard through raising the sheep and all that stuff. You could be losing all that stuff that you worked really hard on. Um, I will say on one of the things that I have mentioned, and I think this is maybe why like maybe butchers do it through the use the plastic, is a lot of people do like to see it, like see
Hmm.
what cut, see what meat.
Yeah.
When packaging it, you're probably more likely to know, okay, I know that size, I know what it looks like, I know what that meat.
Yeah.
But for someone who doesn't know the cuts as well, because they either haven't done it themselves or they're sending it off, a lot of people like to have it come back and go, oh, okay, that's the ribs, that's the this, that's the whatever.
Yeah.
I can just open my thing up and see it.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely for my customers, everything is paper or not paper, is plastic sealed.
Mhm.
Um, and for what I'm selling, absolutely. People want to see how many chops are in that package if it's something like that, and they want to see the quality of it. When I paper wrap, sometimes I will put like if it's loin chops, I'll say 2 or 4 loin chops because I can't see it. So I'll make little notes there about maybe portion size, But
Weight.
yeah, that's a good thing. Yeah, that's a good thing to mention.
Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of when you're doing it yourself, it's kind of a preference. I love the
Mhm.
idea of being able to compost because if you are raising your own animals for meat, you're going to end up with a lot of meat. You're going to end up with having to wrap a lot,
Mhm.
and that's a lot of plastic you're throwing away. If it's someone like you or someone who has a lot more meat coming through, that's a lot. If
Yeah.
you only have maybe one, maybe it's not so much, maybe you don't care. But I love the fact that you mentioned that. Um, have you ever done the old fashioned like salting the meat and curing it that way?
Um, no. So I've done a little bit of curing. When I was in college, I had access to a dry aging case,
Mm.
and so we could monitor humidity and temperature. And I made some sheep, like what is it called? You know, cured sheep leg, basically. And so it was like a charcuterie. That's
Oh,
what it was.
I was thinking
Um,
turkey, but I was like, no, that's not it.
yeah. So I've done that, but I've only done it with, excess technology. At home, I haven't tried it. It's a dream of mine. I've read about it. I've listened to people, um, and I'm like totally ready to try some of that stuff. I just haven't. The food safety thing scares me a little bit. Um, and it's totally doable, but I think you need to be well learned on it. So it's not something to like just try for fun. It's something to really research and read up on, make sure you're ready, and make sure that you're ready to throw something out if it doesn't look right. If something went wrong in the process, whether it was your fault or not. Yeah, not a project that I have tried yet, but it's definitely on my bucket list.
And I think that's another point to make too, is that if you're trying either new recipes or just different techniques, maybe not do multiple cuts. Try something either maybe not the nicest cut, try something like just be smart about what piece of meat you're using. Because like you said, there's some cuts that are just naturally better. And if you don't know what you're doing, you could really screw that up.
Hmm.
And so, maybe you should test it on something that's maybe not the nicest cut until you get that skill kind of taken care of, and then you can kind of move on from there.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, so before we go into the shearing, I have one more question, and this I guess is maybe a personal opinion. But what do you find is the difference in taste on your own butchered meat versus something you buy at the store?
Yeah. Um, so I really have a different opinion on this across species. So like with store-bought beef versus I mean I don't really raise beef often, but beef that I've been given, I don't see as much of a difference. Store-bought veal versus my veal, not too much. With sheep, it's not so much a difference between store-bought and mine. It's country of origin.
Mm.
So I have heard a lot of bad experiences from people about store bought lamb. And when I dig a little deeper, I find out that they ended up with Australian lamb. And, nothing against Australian sheep producers because they're doing a lot of things right with the way that they raise sheep in that country. But it's a different environment. Those sheep are fed on different feed, they're a different breed of sheep. And it's not really the type of meat that the American consumer is accustomed to.
Mm.
So I hear from small sheep producers all the time that their customers are so happy with the flavor of their lamb. And of course, we all want to use that as our marketing strategy to say that we raise the most flavorful, best tasting lamb. Um, but when it comes down to it, and I've talked to some, senior sheep farmers who back me up on this theory, it's not so much that each of us is doing something spectacular. No offense, sorry, to steal anyone's thunder, but it's It's raising sheep appropriately in our climate, um, and not having the type of sheep that is grown in Australia that makes a different flavor. So, um, that kind of segues into my other tidbit. If you're looking to think at all about meat quality, is think about what breed you're raising and what their country of origin might be. So, and also just region. So not necessarily country of origin of that breed, but regionality. So here in the Northeast, long wool type breeds really thrive because of the climate that we have. In the Midwest, and in the Western Rocky ranges, it's a very different type of sheep that's going to thrive in that environment and be grown in the most sustainable way. Two different types of meat. So lamb, maybe more than something like beef or pork, can be seriously affected by where it's grown. And it's not necessarily because someone's doing something wrong or right. It's just the type of sheep and the type of feed. Is that animal eating lush Kentucky bluegrass and orchard grass, or is it munching on sagebush? And either animal could be just as healthy, but it's going to result in a different product. So think about what your land is capable of and what type of sheep are going to thrive there. If you're focused on something like dairy, obviously you have other things to consider. But if you're focused really on meat, you can make a lot of decisions based on something like that. And if you're going to buy lamb, or you're sending someone to buy lamb, look for American lamb. Even if you don't want to buy it from a small producer, if you want to go to the grocery store, just really look for that American label. That's a huge like advocating that I try and do, because I think it's important to support the American lamb industry, but you're also probably just going to get a better product suited to what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's really interesting because a lot of people go into sheep that I've talked to for heritage breeds. So um, they want to help breeds that need more help,
Yeah.
um, or that are dying off in the U.S., which is a great thing. But it also, you have to consider, well, maybe if it's a sheep from, the Highlands of Scotland, um,
Yeah.
you're in California, with, the temperature, the climates and all that stuff is very different, and that can affect your meat. I also think you mentioned from different countries, but the one thing I wanted to add to that is that's a long way for that meat to travel.
Yeah.
That's a lot of temperature changes. I mean, I know that people, you try to do it as best as possible in freezers and
Mhm.
stuff, but it's still a lot of time that something's stuck in the freezer or being transported. So I would think that that would affect it as well. Um, I would also say to the breed, because I know for us, we were doing milk primarily, so we have East Frisians, but they're crossed with Gulf Coast. And the reason that we got them from a farm in Alabama, and East Frisians aren't great with heat. So they crossed them so that they could handle the heat a little bit better. And
Mhm.
so that's something to consider too, is not just the sole main breed, but also potentially what it's crossed with. If you have a sheep that you absolutely love and you don't want to part with it, but you can introduce some genetics to kind of help with that. It'll take longer for that flock to get to probably the level you want. Um,
Mhm.
but so that's why it's like sometimes people go into it and you're like, think before you buy. But if
Yeah.
but if you just decided to buy something that you realized wasn't great, then you can add genetics to the flock, um,
Mhm.
to sort of help that out. It'll just take a little bit longer for that flock to probably get to the level that you want. So even if you have a sheep that's, the meat's maybe not the best quality, you could try to breed if you have like 10 and you don't want to like sell them all and start over, you can kind of introduce rams that have better meat and better genetics to kind of help with that. It's just
I've got an example of that. So I shear for someone who raises Icelandics, and they chose that breed because they took a vacation to Iceland and thought it was the best lamb ever. And so she came to America, or came back home to America and got Icelandics because she thought, well, that breed must taste the same everywhere.
Mm,
And, you know, you take Icelandics who are used to Iceland and move them to Vermont, it's different. So she's been a little disappointed because they grow so slowly and they don't taste the way she wanted them to. So she brought in a fin ram, and she's crossing them. And she loves her ewes. So just like you said, she's not going to get rid of those Icelandic ewes, but she's not going to breed any more purebreds. And if you're not trying to sell purebred animals, there's really no reason not to cross in something else. And you can improve meat quality hugely in that way, and you'll also just get healthier lambs, because of that hybrid vigor. So yeah, crossbreeding is a great way to go, to improve meat quality and all sorts of traits in your flock if you want to move in another direction but aren't ready to start fresh.
yeah, yeah, but also consider if you are doing the 4-H, some things won't be accepted. I think I spoke to someone and, a lot of areas don't I think most areas don't do dairy sheep for 4-H.
Hmm.
So, like, our sheep, we wouldn't even be able to use because they don't do dairy breeds.
Yeah.
So that's something to kinda consider too, like, if you want to do 4-H and really push the clean genetics, um, that then you can't really do that, so you should probably look really hard and really consider what's going to be good for your area.
Yeah.
That goes all into genetics and breeding. um, so we'll kind of swing back around and do a few questions on shearing. We had a shearing discussion that talked about people who sheared at home, and I kind of wanted to talk about your perspective because you do it as a business, so it is something where you do go to other people's properties, and help them out. So I guess because we're going to go at this as a business perspective, um, who do you find is the most common reason or type of farm that come to you for help?
Yeah, so I say we, me and my partner both shear, sometimes together and sometimes apart. So we cover a ton of territory and a ton of different farms. And we run into all different people with different goals for their flocks, different reasons for them. Um, I stick mainly around the Northeast, because I'm the head shepherd. So I can never go too far away. And I shear mostly for small flocks that have sheep either as like a retirement project, or as lawnmowers, just land management, and a lot of hand spinners, small flocks of people who grow wool just for themselves or just for themselves and a couple friends or like their local spinning field. And um, for the people who just have sheep as like lawnmowers, they're usually not super into the ag. So they're not really into the tools and maybe not as willing to get kind of down and dirty and do this themselves. For the other type, for a lot of the fiber folks, they really, really appreciate and respect the amount of skill and practice that goes into being a professional shearer and to get the highest quality wool clip possible, whether it's for themselves or to sell. They know it's worth paying someone like myself to come out and do that. So I've heard so many people just badmouth shears saying that they're too expensive or they had this one awful experience and that means they'll never hire a shearer again. And of course, there's some mistakes that happen. I think most shearers are good people, but of course there's a dud in every crowd. So I'm really encouraged when I work with people like this because it's the total opposite. They thank me up and down. We can talk about wool quality together. They'll ask for my feedback because I'm working over an entire animal. I see that whole fleece. We can discuss their breeding program or what projects they have for that type of wool. And I learn just as much from them as they can learn from me some days. Besides that, we also shear for plenty of commercial farms who have just a ton of animals. And even if they're the most in shape farmers out there, they can't shear, 200 or 300 head. So they'll hire us and we'll get the job done in a fraction of the time from what it would take them to do it.
I think it's also a good thing to point out because I've also talked to people like this who are physically unable to do it. Um, Whether it's they still love their animals, but they either have arthritis or there's other things where it just is a little physically hard for them. If you're an older farmer, sometimes back issues can come into play. So um, that's another thing that I don't know how if you find you have a lot of those customers as well. Um,
Yeah. It is extremely physically demanding. In a 8-hour shearing day, we burn approximately the same amount of calories as someone who's running a marathon. So, that gives you some perspective. It's really hard on your body. And my partner and I are both still pretty young, so we're lucky we can really work ourselves hard. But not just like shearing clients who are unable to shear anymore, but also older shearers will pass us a lot of work because they're getting too old for it. Their back or their knees or their hands are giving out and they don't want to shear thousands of sheep a year anymore. So they send the work to us, and it's a great community to be a part of. I have no complaints there.
Great. So because you're coming onto someone else's farm, and I'm assuming the sheep don't know you too well, how do you handle, first of all, when you come to someone's farm, whether when they're new, like maybe there's someone who has never had a shearer before, how do you talk to them, make them feel comfortable with you around their animals? What kind of questions do they ask you? Um, and then how do you get comfortable? So how do you get comfortable with the owners? And then how do you kind of work your way into getting comfortable with the sheep?
Yeah. So usually this all starts with either a phone call or an email. And I try and be really generous in those communications. So I'm pretty open with people and I try and make sure that they know they can be open with me. I've shorn for plenty of people who's like, this is their first year with sheep or getting a shearer. Um, and I just try and be really generous with what knowledge I can offer up or telling them to feel free to ask me questions. So in those first communications, I actually send them to our website and I have a page set up that explains what I expect from my customers on a good shearing day. And like I've said to some people who are new to the sheep thing, I'm not gonna yell at you if you can't make all these things happen. But it's a two-way street, and if you can provide these things, it'll make my job easier, and ultimately, most importantly, it'll make the sheep happier. So I provide that in advance, so they kind of know what to expect, and they can talk to me about it if they have any issues. And then when I show up, the first thing I like to do once there's a little introduction is just get to see the sheep, get to see the setup. And lots of people will just start telling me about their farm, and I'm totally cool with that. I'm happy to hear about it. Um, and sometimes people will just start asking questions right away about the setup, about what they can do if they did these things right. Um, People who know a little bit about me know that I'm really into purebred sheep and showing and genetics and such. So they'll ask me about my opinions on their animals, maybe if they're getting started. We'll talk about fleece quality and what they kind of expect. Um, so we shear for plenty of people who have no plans with their wool. If they don't tell me that when I get there, I'll ask them. I will shear every single sheep in the same way. I want to get the highest quality wool clip possible, no matter what. But if I know that they're going to use it for hand spinning or they're going to sell it for hand spinning or they're going to give it to me, they don't want it, or they're going to throw it in the compost, um, it's just nice to know where they're coming from. What are their goals for the day? Um, so yeah, that's the general kind of what we cover with everyone. I always try and make some conversation with people, just it can be stressful and it can be a tough day for some people. So if we can talk kind of in a lighthearted tone about something, sheep always do funny things during shearing. So something funny that happens, or an animal that's really curious, or if they have a ram that looks really good, I'm happy to compliment people on their sheep. We can talk about maybe where he came from or something like that. It's really fun and really social, which is really nice aspect for me working with all these different people.
And what do you do? Do you do anything special with the sheep to get them more comfortable? Because I think the people I spoke to about the home shearing, they do a lot of stand shearing. And
Hmm.
I've seen videos of you where you're flipping them all over the place. Um, and I'm assuming that would make them, if they're not used to being handled, that would make it sometimes difficult, at least to get started. Um, so how do you handle that kind of situation?
Yeah. So part so to start, um, the stand shearing. People ask me all the time, like, why don't you do that? That'd be so much easier. And no, it's just if you don't know those animals inside and out. So if it's not your home flock, that is the most dangerous possible way to shear. And people who know their animals and do it with their animals, like that's, I have no problem with that. But I could never show up to someone else's farm and put an animal on a stand that's maybe never seen a stand and work with it. So the way that we shear, it's called the Bowen Method, and it's the most widely used technique around the whole world. And so what it does is it sits the sheep on their butt. And I won't get into the very specific techniques about where you angle their weight and where my toes and my knees and my left hand goes, but
You have videos
um,
on your
yes.
Instagram and stuff like that that
Yeah,
show that, and we'll share
yep,
that information at the very end, but just wanted to throw
yeah.
that out there for anyone who's like, "Well, wait a minute," like,
Yeah.
all that information on her media.
Yeah. So that whole method um, is designed entirely for the sheep's safety and to reduce stress. And you can find some research about what I'm about to talk about. But animals such as sheep have no natural defense other than to run away, right? So in the wild, just like a deer, the only thing they can really do is run. So their defense mechanism is all 4 feet on the ground. So when you remove that capability from them, um, they naturally kind of give up. Um, they just relax. They just kind of say, "Well, this is what it is," and they just go into this zen. Of course, it's not every single sheep. There are individual cases of animals who just don't want anything to do with it, and it's a little more work on my end to keep them calm. But a huge part of it is also my attitude. And so some shearers tend to be in a huge rush, and it is good to shear sheep as quick as you can safely, for their health, to get them through the process as quickly as you can. But one of the things that Colin and I get complimented on all the time is how calmly we handle the sheep. So when we go into the pen to grab our first animal, one of the things I tell people, like from my website on my how to prepare for shearing day, it says to have them penned up tightly and penned up close to me. So sheep are flocking animals. If you crowd them in a pen together, as long as it's not a scorching hot day, are going to be more comfortable. They're with their friends. They feel safe when they're in a tight little group, and it's easier for me to go in and grab one. I don't have to chase them. Once you start chasing the animals, the day is just going to be a hard one for everybody. So having them penned up tightly with their friends, and then if I can remain calm and cool and collected, then things tend to go pretty well. And it's tough. I've been kicked in the face. I'm covered in bruises some days. I'm beat up by some of these animals. But the most important thing that I have to do is just not get upset about it. and because the animal will channel that. So it's a lot about the way that I carry myself, and the client I'm working for can play into that. Some people get really worked up. It can be a stressful day if there's a bunch of things going on, but it's great if everyone can try and keep that mindset when they're working around the animals.
So if an animal were to be stressed, I'm assuming it'd be very obvious. They're like the kicking and the thrashing. Is there any like subtle signs that an animal is stressed that are harder to see? Either their eyes are like twitching or something. Just signs that something's up or that like maybe we need to take a minute or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely before I get my hands on an animal, if I see that it is panting, or if it is, like you said, kind of the eyes, if they're darting around, those are signs that they might be a little more worked up. And not so much individual things I look for, but kind of the whole flock as one, because everyone's flock and everyone's sheep are different. They're going to act different, they're used to things that are different. So I'll look at how the rest of the flock is behaving, and if any one sheep kind of separates itself in any way, I'll pay attention to that. And maybe I'll ask the owner, does this sheep, do we know this sheep has a problem? There are definitely some shepherds who know they have one or two animals that are just horrible for their shearers no matter what. And if they tell me that, great. I like to know, maybe that animal needs to be handled a little differently. So each flock I work with is really a totally different scenario, and that's a skill I think that we just pick up with time, working with thousands of animals and getting acclimated to each flock, whether they're brand new customer or a return customer. um, Being able to read the animals as a whole and those individuals that kind of set themselves apart.
I would think that would be the similar to if an animal was injured. Either
Mhm.
like their hooves are too long and it's kind of you would notice them either limping or just walking different. Because
Mhm.
sometimes I would think that depending on how involved the shepherdess is, that maybe they don't know something's up. Um, so you
Yeah.
just kind of being aware of like, oh, that one's walking kind of funny. Maybe I need to like ask them about it. And if not, maybe we just need to have either the shepherd look at them while I'm doing the other guys, or
Yep.
something like that. Just kind of be like, something's up. A lot of people will say that sheep, it's hard to tell, but I think if you're around them long enough, you can kind of pick up on that stuff. Um,
Definitely.
One of the things I know that someone mentioned before is that lanolin plays a big part in how easy it is to shear, depending on the weather. Like the
Mhm.
colder it is, the harder the lanolin is, and the more damage it can do to shears. Do you have like a temperature minimum that you will do it, or is it, you know what, you paid for this day, I'm coming out, and we just have to deal with the lanolin's, you know, texture, or whatever? Or do you go, you know what, this is really, really cold. I can't do it this day, but we'll have to reschedule.
Yeah, we basically shear year round in any temperature.
Mm.
Um, I guess it's never gotten so hot that I have put my foot down as long as I have shade. So like we shear a huge flock in the middle of the summer, but they're in a barn. So we have fans going and it was fine. Um, as for winter, the lanolin can kind of clam up, but my equipment um, stays warm enough
Mm.
that it usually doesn't cause a problem. And another thing that helps, like I just talked about, getting those sheep penned up tight. If you put them in a barn or a pen, any enclosure, and you get them packed fairly tight,
Mm.
their body heat will all work and raise the temperature right there, and loosen things up a bit. So temperature isn't so much of an issue. It's more precipitation. We cannot shear wet sheep. Um, if I'm never shearing one sheep in a day. Sometimes I have three different farms to go to, and I just don't want to get wet and then go shear someone else's dry sheep. It's also dangerous. I'm working with an electric piece of equipment, and I have been electrocuted. And a wet, dirty sheep can cause disease transmission to humans. I know shearers who have gotten really sick from shearing wet sheep. So it's not none of those risks are worth it to us. So we do require, no matter the time of year, that sheep are dry for shearing. And that's not something we're willing to compromise on for our safety and for the sheep's.
Can you talk a little bit about, and I know we're getting a little over on time, so we'll try to make this short, but can you talk a little bit about the equipment that you use, what's provided by the farmer, and what you bring with you?
Mhm. Yeah, so I bring my shearing machine, which is a pretty big setup, but it's ready to go into just about any setting. So I can hang it from all different types of spaces. I travel with a piece of plywood that I can shear on, but as part of my guide that I provide to my customers, providing your own sheet of plywood is ideal. We like to keep all of our equipment clean, but there is no way to sanitize wood. So I can't guarantee that some bacteria is from a different farm got into that wood and I cleaned it out. So if you provide your own plywood, that's ideal. And then the basic setup, we're pretty lenient about where we shear and stuff like that, as long as you have the sheep caught and ready for us, as long as they're dry, as long as they're near an area where we're going to shear. I don't want to have to drag that sheep across the barn. I want either the sheep moved over here or a space over there where I can shear. So we don't ask too much. A power source, the sheep caught, and decently flat, well lit spot to work.
Do you collect the wool and store it, or is that the farmer's job?
That's the farmers. We do take a lot of wool. Um, People who just don't have a market for it will give it to us sometimes. If we know we can find a buyer, then we are offering to buy some wool from people. But ultimately, it's the farmer's responsibility to gather it up, bag it, and have a plan for it. If they want us to just kick it off the shearing board because they're going to throw it away, I don't mind doing that. But they need to kind of have something ready to go beforehand. And if farmers have questions about that and they reach out to me ahead of time, I'm happy to help. We can definitely bring some extra things and help you get through that, but something that I need to be prepared for that I'm not immediately doing at every farm.
Okay, and so we're gonna wrap it up just here because I know we're a little over 10 o'clock. Um, can you share either some tips, tricks, just things for the audience that you want them to know? We'll get into media after. This is more of a anything about shearing or meat that you kind of want to leave them with. Um, whether it's, again, just reiterating the philosophy or something brand new, just something you want them to consider or think about, or that you want to share.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing, and this could be applied to all types of sheep management, is be willing be willing and open to potential changes that might be appropriate for your flock. So when it comes to meat production, when it comes to processing, when it comes to wool production and shearing and what animals you can handle, I know a lot of people who research, find the breed for them, get them, and it turns out it's different. Um, and that might just be because of your setup. It might be because of where you got the sheep from. It might be because not everything you read on the internet is correct, believe it or not. So, especially when you get into the heritage breeds or whatever it is you want, just be willing to consider change. It might be beneficial for you to phase that breed of sheep out and bring in a new one, or do some crossbreeding, or work with another farmer. Ask them, hey, can I come to your farm for shearing day and see how things go there with your sheep? Um, you know, we as a business, as a farm, as an entrepreneur, as a shearer, we all need to be ready and willing to adjust to things as they happen. Um, and we all want to fall in love with our flocks, but to benefit your animals and your land as much as possible, you might need to make some changes along the way. So be ready for that, and don't be afraid to maybe reconsider what your plan is, and go from there.
I think that that's true for every farm, but especially this year, we're all getting a good practice in being flexible and having plans change.
Yeah.
So, can you share a little bit about where they can find you? You can share your website where they can kind of look at some of the tips that you talk about when a shearer comes in, and um, your where they can find those videos of you actually showing how you share, and
Mhm.
talk through that.
Yeah. So you can find all about our farm and our shearing business at www.yankeerockfarm.com. And you'll find a little tab on there about shearing. So you can see all of that. Um, And then you can find me on Instagram, also Yankee Rock Farm, and Facebook under Yankee Rock Farm. And we also have a Facebook page just for the shearing, which is branded as Yankee Clippers Shearing. So through all of those social media platforms, I share just as much, I think, about our shearing business as I do our farm. And I really love helping to educate people there. And then um, yeah, so there's some shearing videos on my Instagram, and if you look into the New York Sheep and Wool Festival, I did a shearing talk there virtually this year, and I went in a little more in depth about some of these shearing things, and there's a video there of Colin shearing one of our sheep. So that's on YouTube. If you search the New York Sheep and Wool Festival shearing talk, I believe you should find it there, and I should have it up on my website somewhere. So
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I learned so much on both sides, and it's going to be a really exciting year for, I think, everybody. Um, and so, yeah, thank you again so much for joining me.
yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
All right, you have a good weekend. Okay.
You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
But yeah, so you do butchering and you do the you have a shearing business, right?
Yeah, so we shear. That's really our job. And the butchering I don't actually do as work anymore. I just We butcher all of our own meat, and then there's just a couple neighbors who I help out. They have some animals and they don't have much help, so I, as a favor, kind of um, process for them. Uh, but yeah, I used to work in a slaughterhouse for while I was in college, and I used to do a little cutting for hire. So
Okay.
I'm I'm happy to not make it a job anymore and just enjoy it.
I know that for some people that's probably a weird thing to say, enjoy butchering.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to be careful with different crowds the way I word these things. Like, I know you would understand, but some people you say that to and they look at you funny.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I've never done it. I grew up in LA, and so I'm like a city girl,
Mhm.
for the most part. And we got our sheep this February. Um,
Okay.
and we got them because I can't do any dairy other than sheep dairy. My
Mhm.
stomach just can't handle it. And so
Mhm.
we were like last summer, like last July, we that kind of came up to the fact like, oh, what is sheep's milk? And you should try it because it's more sensitive to the stomach. And then we tried it, and I was like, okay, this has to be a thing in my life. Because I was not always sensitive to dairy. So like I grew up with cheese and
Mm.
ice cream. And so it wasn't like so I had a lot of that up until probably 3 or 4 years ago, and then I went 2 years without it because my stomach just and I thought I could never have dairy ever again. And then when
Mm.
we found the sheep's milk, I was like, "Okay, this has to be a thing." So, and that was last July. So that was weirdly the turning point in my head of like, let's have animals. So I mean, that was very quick. It's a very quick turnaround. Within, I don't know, 6 months we had sheep, and we had
Mhm.
baby sheep, so we got lambs. My husband always wanted cows, and I was just kind of like, yeah, all right, whatever. If you want cows, that's fine. It'll be your thing.
Yeah.
I wasn't really in the mindset of like, oh, I want to be a farmer. It's like, it's okay. I'll be a farmer's wife while you do all the work. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, the sheep thing is your thing. So now you have to be a farmer. And I'm like, oh, I don't know anything about this.
Nice.
So, and because we got babies this year, we haven't really even had to deal with the culling or, which sheep are better milkers because we just haven't, our first milking season is going to be next year. So,
Mhm.
so we're just kind of, I know it's coming, like, having to cull and figure all that out.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one of the reasons I kind of started this kind of conference, because I just realized I don't know as much as I would like to, and I know everybody
Mhm.
else has all like a lot more experience than I do.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I just want to talk to people and real people. I mean, I don't know about other people, but I have two little kids. I don't have time to really sit down and like read a
Mhm.
300-page book.
Yeah.
Talking about all the things that could happen, or all the things that um, either could go wrong, or in a perfect world, this is how it should be. I'm like, no, I really need to talk to real people. And like, what do you really experience on a daily basis?
For sure.
Seasonally. Um,
Yeah.
so so you guys do meat, and do you guys do anything with your wool?
Yeah, so this year actually, just officially in September, we launched our first yarn of farm yarn.
Okay.
Um, so we've been selling our raw wool, just because the network that we're in, we've always had a decent enough market, whether it's to hand spinners or there's a couple mills that we work with who just buy our raw wool, so it's just done, paycheck to us, wool to them. But this year we're officially full time now with the farm, so we got some yarn made and we're selling that. Um, but it's tough. I mean, so in our shearing business, we also get given and purchase several thousand pounds of wool a year.
Mm,
And we're working on building the local market so that we can help more farmers get some money for their wool. Because commercially, you get under $1 a pound
mm,
on average. And for a lot of people, it's just not worth it. So, there are other avenues. Like there are lots of mills and small yarn makers and shops who want to sell local, sustainable wool products. But bridging that gap between the small farmer who doesn't really have time to market their wool or worry about it, and these really high end mills and shops is tough. That's where we're trying to kind of step in and help everyone involved. So that's been our biggest project with the wool, focusing probably more on that than my own at the moment. But
yeah, because I know that for mills, you have to have a minimum. It's minimum weight, right? It's not mass, it's weight.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep, and every mill's a little different. So I know some mills who will take like just 10 pounds of wool, but your price is going to be crazy more expensive to get that processed than 100 pounds. And these big wool buyers, they don't want to deal with anything under 100 pounds. So if we can group wool together for people and move it in one big lot, that should help the stream of materials.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Especially because I think with COVID and everything, people are going more towards the farming. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm finding, just from hearsay, because like I said, I haven't really had to deal with it yet. Um, both butchering and shearing are like two of the things that everything's like backed up,
Yeah.
wise. Um, and it's one of those like growing pains that I feel that the community itself is kind of going through, that was probably prompted and pushed a little bit by COVID, but I know that it was kind of a turn anyway.
Yep.
Um,
Exactly.
so it was just kind of like people who were initially thinking about it, and then this happened and going, oh, okay, yes, we have to do this.
Yeah.
or people like me who just like we got our sheep in February, so that was like a month before everything went crazy. Um, and I was also I think we got pregnant in February too. So like our whole world kind of got very busy and very crazy. Um, and so like dealing with just having lambs and stuff, like that was already planned for. And then COVID hit and it was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad we started this now. Before prices went up or before it was harder to find, animals or, things like that. So